Alrighty, ladies and gentlemen, it's that time again where we learn more about FileMaker Pro. My name is Matt Petrowski, and I'm happy to bring you the content that I know about FileMaker Pro. Today's lesson, we're taking a look at Boolean checkboxes. I've covered them so much on the magazine website. There's so many things you can do with just a simple checkbox. Stick with me, and we'll be on my desktop in just a few. All right, now, as you know, I am shooting these live, so we are going to do some live development here. You can follow along with what I'm going to instruct in this particular video. I'm going to do a little check off to the side here, make sure everything is all as it should be, and it is. All right. We have been developing a file in this series. In fact, if you are interested in going back to the #1 video because you found this as part of your your YouTube search or something, don't worry, in this video you will get a very cool lesson about Boolean checkboxes or checkboxes in general. These are yes/no checkboxes and all the cool things you can do with them. But if you want to go back and you want to go in sequence, click on the channel icon and then you will be taken to the channel page here on YouTube and you'll be able to actually select these series and watch them 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. All right, so the file that I am going to be using as I show it here on my desktop has been called time track. We've got a couple of different reference files that we use as well. Those are just FileMaker files. I've covered those in previous videos, so if you go back and you watch the series, you will know the reference databases that I'm using. It's basically FileMaker's own time billing, which we can access through FileMaker's, I forget what it's called. It's in the Get Started area that you have right here. I'm working on a copy of FileMaker 16, by the way, and let's go ahead and hide that one. But my reference database, which you do not have a copy of, is this one right here, Time Tracker. I had a problem, and that was that I did not finish developing this database. So I'm taking this opportunity to work with you to learn FileMaker to develop it out. Now, we have been going through a number of things in this solution so far. As you can tell, we've got a lot of duplicate buttons. We have 2 different projects buttons. We've learned 2 different ways to actually show projects. One of them is a card window. That was in our last video. Another one is using a bunch of not a bunch, but a few relationships that use Cartesian joins. You can go back and look at the self-relationship video, and basically we get to pick what we want to do in terms of how we do things in FileMaker. Today's video is going to be super simple. What we're going to be doing is basically just creating a checkbox. Now, we have projects, and one of the problems that I had in my solution is that I've added my value list, but my value list does not whittle down based on any type of criteria. For example, I want it to only show what are the current active projects, and we've been building up to that point, and now we need to actually say whether a project is active or not. So if you're following along in this file, we're going to go into Manage Layouts, and that's with Command-Shift-L on the Macintosh, or Command-Control-L probably on Windows. We had created this particular layout, the Edit Projects, in the previous video in this series, and I'm just going to click and open that, and we're going to work with creating a Boolean checkbox. Now, a Boolean checkbox is nothing more than the fact that you are going to store a single value, most often a number, into a field, and you're going to represent that with a checkbox. Now, there's a very common way to do this in FileMaker. As I go into layout mode, we can see that we have our active field right here. And if we go into our defined database, we can see that quite simply our active number field is what it is. It's a number field. So on each record, I'm simply just going to store a number. And that's going to be a 1 or a 0. Now, there's a couple of things that I can do. First off, we know that because of the auto enter options, we don't really have to choose this one of data if we don't want to, but if we're lazy, we can. And that's what I do in this particular situation because it's almost exactly the same as clicking this, going into a FileMaker dialog, adding whatever default value I want, if it's 1, and then I have to decide, do I want this checkbox, yes or no, and so It's here. We can use it. So if you want the default to be checked, my suggestion is that 1 is your affirmative or your yes, and 0s are your no's. So if your defaults for the particular checkbox that you're dealing with is 0 or unchecked, use a 0. Otherwise, use a 1. All right, so that's pretty easy. The next stage in the process is we need to actually display this as a checkbox. Now, everything that we do on FileMaker's layout is typically, not everything I should say, most things are controlled by using the inspector. So as we collapse these a little bit, we'll have to figure out which one it is where we are going to set this setting. It's actually on the fourth tab, or the fourth area, the data tab of the inspector, where we're going to control this. We're going to turn this into a checkbox quite easily just by setting it to a checkbox set. Now, we don't have a value list quite yet. Now, the most common thing to do is to create a value list. I clicked on the little pencil icon there, and we can create this value list. And this is probably the most common value list in all of FileMaker development. You can call this yes, no. You can call it checked. You can call it unchecked. My typical approach is just to call it Boolean, because that's the value that's being stored in the field. It is either a yes or a no. In other words, a 1 or a 0. Super simple. Now, typically, the only thing that I put here, and this is probably the only value list where I use FileMaker's custom value list. Otherwise, most value lists in a real FileMaker solution always end up being defined from a field because I have more control. And go watch the environment series and go look at the options where we talk about the options and value lists, and you'll find out why I don't use custom values. But in this particular case, I do. Typically, we put a 1 because when it's unchecked, it's nothing. You don't necessarily have to put the 0, but you can if it makes you feel comfortable, if you like that. All right, so now that we've got that, we've got our Boolean, we've got our checkbox. FileMaker really only gives us a couple of display options when it comes to an icon, and these only came about, I believe, with either FileMaker 15 or FileMaker 16. Formerly, you did not have this option if you're working with a copy of FileMaker 13, 14, 12, so on. You don't have this check versus X. You just get what FileMaker used, and I believe they used the X. We now get this fancy little check that I believe that we can use in order to represent that it's checked. So everything's all well and good there, except for the fact that it displays this 1. So as we go into browse mode, we get all of our data here, and let's move this window to the side so we can see it. Okay, so this really doesn't reflect well in the user interface. As I've always stated throughout this whole series, how you store data and how you present data can be two completely separate things. In fact, we're going to learn that we don't even have to use FileMaker's particular checkbox in order to show or represent a checkbox. Some really cool little trick. So I can check this. Let's check a couple of them that are active. I'm going to say these are active. Now here is a very typical solution to this particular problem. As I go back into layout mode and we take a look at this particular checkbox, this is very common to just basically shrink this up. Well, first off, I'm going to make it a little bit larger, and I'm doing that with the Command, Option, Shift, and the greater than, less than in order to grow the size of this actual checkbox, because I don't really care about the number. What I'm going to do is I'm going to shrink this up. Now notice that as I drag, things are popping on the layout. If you find that to be an annoyance, you can actually hold down the Command key or the Control key, I believe, on Windows, and what will happen is it will ignore any of the settings, such as the snap to grid or snap to other objects, and it'll allow you to smoothly drag things. And we can see that I dragged this so that the 1, or the actual value that's on the actual value list that the checkbox widget is obligated to display, is no longer displaying. And so I go back into browse mode, and I have the checkbox, but now it's not really reflective of, this is just a floating checkbox. I want it to obviously say something. So there's a couple of ways that you can deal with this. The most common of them is to simply just add a button. And this is what has been done for a long time in the world of FileMaker, is you add a button, and one of the common tricks to solve problems within FileMaker is to layer things on top of other things. In fact, of all of computer design and layout design, many times you're obscuring things. Some things are partially on screen, partially off screen. Like in HTML, when you're going to use a bunch of different little icons to represent something, they'll create one large graphic with all of the icon versions in that one graphic and then only show a portion of it. It's called sprites. Similar things can be done in FileMaker, but here what I want to do is basically say active. Now we're going to talk about some distinctions or some differences between FileMaker, I think it was 15 when button bars came out. Maybe it was it may have been 14 when it came out. This is a distinction that you really should be aware of because it actually comes into play a little bit of the time. So here is our button. This is the long-standing standard button tool in all of FileMaker. Then FileMaker introduced this button bar tool. Now, one of the things that FileMaker does is as they add new things to the solution, they get the opportunity to add in new functionality. But when it comes to their older objects, because they maintain a long-running ability to open legacy systems, they don't. FileMaker is really good at not breaking things with new versions, but it also prevents FileMaker from moving forward in some areas. There are some distinctions between using a regular button versus using a single segment button bar. Now, when you drag out a button bar, FileMaker defaults to showing 3 options, and you can get rid of 2 of those so that you're left with a single segment button bar. Now, as I type in this heads-up display right here, and I type the word active, and we advance that. Now, unfortunately, this particular button bar is it's black, so it's not going to look super good. I won't take the time to fix it right now because we don't need to. The distinction or the difference here is when I double click and we see the HUD for the button bar setup, make note that we have the ability to access FileMaker's calculation dialog box. So anytime that you can access the calculation dialog box, you have full access to the calculation engine and you can do all kinds of stuff to whatever you want to compute and show as the title of the button. Let's compare that to the button object. The button object, when we double click, the heads up comes up here, and notice that this is not a calculation. It's just a literal string. But when we look at this, there's one thing that's sort of nice about the button that unless you knew FileMaker from days prior, you may not know that if I select the text tool, I cannot click. Notice that when I click on the button bar, I clicked right on the face of that button bar into that one segment. Nothing happened. In fact, it just allowed me to start to add text here on top of that object. Well, I don't want that text, but let's use the text tool and let's select into the button. Notice that you're actually able to select into the button with the text tool, which is sort of cool because what it does is it affords us the opportunity to actually do a merge. In other words, we can merge anything that we want into this button. But when we think about it, do we lack that ability in a single segment button bar? Well, of course we don't. We can simply just add the actual field. So here's the difference. Here I would select and I could actually put in the word. I'm going to hold down Command, Option, and M, which is the menu command for, let's take a look at the menu. Under the insert menu of merge field or merge variable. Now these two things, when it comes to putting them on your objects, are really cool because they allow you to do the cool things that we're going to be able to see in the remainder of this video. So with that Command Option in, I can actually load in active. So that's pretty cool. Let's shrink up the name so that we can get everything on screen here. All right, so currently we're solving the problem of the fact that this particular widget, which is formatted as an actual checkbox, isn't really showing me what I want to show. Now there's a couple of options that I'm starting to show you here. Let's move those off to the side, make this even a little bit bigger. The easiest option here was to simply have, I just took a copy of that button, simply to have the word active hovering over this particular object. Now I'll shrink this up a little bit. We'll show the inspector. I will go to the design area, the third area, or the appearance area. I'll expand my graphic and I will set the fill of this button to be none so that I can see the checkbox underneath. And then I'm basically just going to, I think everything's going to, I'll turn off the line as well. I don't want that. I'm going to suck up the normal. I'm going to go to the hover. I'm going to paste that. I'm going to go to the pressed. I'm going to paste that and paste that. So basically getting all of the 4 styles for a button to be the same, unless I want the pressed, which I could take the time to do, and I showed you how to do in the previous lesson. So when I go into browse mode, what I get is I now have at least the word relative to the actual state right here. I would expect that I can click this in order to flip the actual state of the checkbox. Because if I click right here, oh, I actually do get to get through the field. And that's because the button is currently not assigned to anything. That's another key takeaway for today's video. Getting a lot of good little tips here. A button which does not have either a single step or a script assigned to it is basically the same thing as text on a layout. So I'm able to click through the actual button, even though the button we can clearly see is overlay on top of the actual checkbox. But you can see in browse mode that I can click through that and still get to the checkbox. Watch what happens when I actually double click and assign this button to a single step. So now that I'm going to assign it to a single step, let's scroll this in so that we can zoom in on it and actually see what we're going to add. I'm going to add a single step to this. Now, granted, with a script, we have a lot more power, but we can always, as I state, we can always convert to script down here if we need to. I like to just start like this. So with a single set field, we can now control or change what this checkbox is. I'm going to click to specify the field. I'm dealing with the active field, very simple. And the logic in this case, we've already used it before, is so simple it's almost not worth mentioning. That's it, not. We just put the word not, and then we put whatever the value is. Now, here's how it works. If the field is initially empty, empty is considered a false value. FileMaker doesn't have down here at the bottom or whatever, but empty and 0 are considered false. So if it is empty, it will flip it to 1. What's the opposite of not 1? Well, it's 0. What's the opposite of not 0? Well, it's 1. So all this is a bit flip right here. This is basically when you put not in front of an actual Boolean number value, it flips it between the two, and that's exactly what we want. So simple, so nice, so easy. So with that set field, I'm able to actually have that work now on the checkbox. So when you click this, it's going to actually flip the checkbox back and forth. And because of the checkbox, because of the value list on the actual checkbox, meaning if you're a 1, show me as checked. Otherwise, if you're not, show me as unchecked. We get that really nice effect. Now, one thing that I don't like about this is as FileMaker has grown up, this is really not that big of a deal. When you have objects layered on top of each other, you achieve the end result. But for me, as the FileMaker purist, I don't really like that necessarily, and I like to take control over these checkboxes. I like to take full control. In fact, if you go over to the FileMaker magazine website, I've got a ton of different videos about this very technique and also about advanced techniques where you can use vector graphic logos. That's part of what you get on FileMaker. When you click on a button setup, you get these new little vectors now, and you can add in any looking checkbox that you want and control the color of the checkbox, which is really, really awesome. So not only do you, 1, get to make the checkbox look exactly like you want, but 2, you get to use FileMaker's conditional formatting to control what color the check actually is within the box. It's a very cool technique. So maybe I'll put that in the either in the description or in the comments. But let's take a look at a little bit of an easier solution. That one involves a little bit more in order to make that happen. But let's think about one of the things that we have here in FileMaker with this button that we've got right next to it. Now right here we've got 2 objects. We've got the actual checkbox, but the user's not really using the checkbox to interact with anymore. So what's doing all of the work is the button. So can we get things down to where we're just using just the one button? Of course we can. We've already looked at this one little trick before, and it's really pretty cool. I love this one. It's very creative. We're going to go to this 4th area in the inspector, the data tab, and we're going to collapse these down. And down at the very bottom, if you remember, there's a trick that I have with regards to a Boolean value. When we specify or we select our object that we want to actually format a certain way, this active is a Boolean number. So when we switch the format right here from general to a Boolean, remember I've already told you you can change these values to be whatever you want. Anything they can be. The only limitation currently, and I've got in my comments into FileMaker, hey, let us use more than 7 characters, is the fact that the limitation is 7 characters. But what would be really cool? This would be really cool. A variable. Being able to put a variable in here and control what displays using FileMaker's formatter, brilliant. Unfortunately, we can't do that currently. That is what we can't do. We can only put in up to 7 characters, however many. As soon as I tab out, you can see FileMaker truncates it right there to only 7. But in this case, it doesn't really matter because we have access to all kinds of cool things. Let's take a look at those cool things. Up here, I have show emoji and symbols. Now this on the Macintosh is controlled, as this comes up, is controlled on your keyboard preference pane. Keyboard preference pane. Let me show you that. Keyboard, bring that up. It is under the preferences on the Macintosh, this one right here, show keyboard and emoji viewers. That'll go up in your menu bar. If you're on Windows, then you're going to use the run menu and type in char map. Now you might be able to make a alias shortcut to that so that you can just double click it on the desktop or put it in your menu bar at the bottom. However you get to it, what we need to see are all of the different possible characters that we can get access to because there's some cool stuff. All right, so I am going to show that, and we are going to take a look. Now, the palette will hover over things, and hopefully we can get it so I can see things here on screen. I think that'll do it for us. All right. So the cool thing is Unicode. We have access to a ton of characters, and some of those are actually, let's take a look, symbols. I think that's where it is, where I saw them. Yep, there we go. This is so cool. So for non-zeros, I want to show this little emoji of a checkbox icon. And for the non-zeros, I want to show this little thing, if it'll actually go in. Hey, are you not going to work? Usually you can select the text in whatever program you're working in and then double check, there we go, double click from the palette in order to inject it in there, right there. But you can see as I scroll, you have access to all of these different emojis. Now, key point here, it has to have that particular display character in the font that's being used on the actual object. So, if you are using Arial versus Verdana versus Tahoma, if that font doesn't actually have all of the different full Unicode character set, then it won't be represented. Now here, when I'm developing for the Macintosh, and if I was developing for iOS, I know pretty much I'm assured that these emoji are going to show up for a lot of your standard fonts, Helvetica, Helvetica New, etc., because Apple puts them in so that they're complete on iOS and Macintosh. On Windows is when you're going to hit the issue because Windows may not have the full character set of all the different emoji that are being used. But you do have access to things such as dingbats. And if you're super comprehensive with your FileMaker solution, I will tell you that it is possible to make a FileMaker solution to store font files into container fields, to export those if the user has access. Now, this is a very advanced thing to do, but to store font files within containers and then export them into the target fonts folder on a given computer, knowing that you'll actually get the font onto the computer so that it's the same font used for all FileMaker clients. But again, super advanced. We'd have to go through all kinds of stuff in order to cover those. The easiest thing is just make sure that the font's actually there. So, moment of truth. There we get our little state right there, although this button currently has not been assigned. So we need to actually assign it to the same action that we did the overlay right here, which is simply a single field, a single step of the set field. So we add our set field. And what field do we want to set? Well, the active. And of course, we want to just do our bit switch, not active, right there, and say OK. Because we want that button to do the same thing. So let's get all of our little things off of the screen here so that we're clean, and we go into browse mode and we see what we get for, there we go. Cool. We have solved the problem of a Boolean checkbox, and we actually, if we do it with this one single button, recognize that we don't even need the Boolean value list anymore, because the only reason that we create the Boolean value list is for the purpose of being able to have FileMaker's checkbox widget actually show whether the check is on or off. So when it comes to Booleans, many times, I don't even create that Boolean value list much anymore, because I know that I can display on screen whether I've got a positive state or a negative state, and I can do it with a trick like this using an emoji. I can overlay if I want to overlay, and there's just so many different things that you can do, and you can even take it beyond where you have full vector control, like I mentioned, that you can find over on the magazine website. So let's get to our questions, because that pretty much gives us our solution for Boolean checkboxes for checking whether or not our projects are active or not in our database. The next stage of what we'll be moving on to is let's filter that list. Let's actually get the list to only show my active projects and make it so that I can click in my projects and just from right here, well, that's your task, I guess. Put that checkbox in here, whichever one you want to use, whether you want to use FileMaker's native checkboxes with a button overlay, or, you know, you don't have to use a button overlay. You could actually use that checkbox and just put the word active right here, or status right above the actual column. You know, one of the things that I don't like about what some developers do, this is, in this particular context, this is super redundant. Having the word active, 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 active is not actually good UI design. While it makes sense right here while we're learning, the better approach is to move this up at the top and put active status as a header, so that right here you just get the checkbox. That becomes a much cleaner user interface. So you can see the name of the project, you can see a checkbox. If you don't know what it is, you can always look up at the header above and see that it's what status it is. That's probably what I'll be doing when I actually implement the UI here on the actual interface. All right, so let's move over to our questions, see if anybody had any questions for today about our content. Oh, as it scrolls in here, mornings, and why must you store it as a number versus text? Primarily because numbers are faster in terms of storing, and when you store a text value, if you're going to store the word yes, you're taking up more bits in order to convey the same principle, whether something is on or off. The number for you from a storage standpoint makes it much easier. Your relationships will evaluate faster with numbers rather than text. Overall, it's just a better, faster way to do things instead of storing the actual text. Is a gray sprite a diet sprite? I have no idea, but good question. Thank you, Matt, for the difference between the button and the button bar. No problem. That's why I'm giving these lessons. All right. Beginner schmiginner. These are all just comments. I need questions. All right, but using a merge can make enormous buttons. Okay, this is a good one right here. Using a merge can make enormous buttons. In fact, let's take a look at this. I'm glad you actually posted that, Jean-Pierre, because let's go ahead and put it into our actual area right here. I am actually going to borrow this button. I'm going to go into layout mode, and I've decided this is the way that I want to format it. I want that checkbox, and we're going to need to make an adjustment because of the fact of the relationship. So I already did the work. I already formatted this button with the formatter with that little option. I'm going to just simply copy it to the clipboard, and I'm going to take it over to this layout, and I'm going to put it in this layout, and we're going to address that exact problem. Thank you. Good question. All right. When we get into the user interface part of FileMaker, we'll talk about containment and how that works. Here I have a related field. Now, because I'm going to do this in the portal, remember I must get the field, the merge field, from the context of the portal. So where this data is being displayed is through the relationship, through the portal all projects. So I have to use fields from that table occurrence, unless I'm using them from multiple tables away. in order for it to actually show the proper data. So that's going to be a bit of a nightmare here. Let's see if I can scroll out a little bit so I can see my text object. There I can. So I just have to remember portal all is where this field now needs to originate from. So as I use my merge with Command Option and M, I have to switch my context to the context that matches this table occurrence. My context is portal all projects active. Now watch what happens. This is exactly what Jean-Pierre mentioned. Active is going to make this astronomically large right there, but it's not going to be a problem because we can always force an object in order to be what we want it to be. And we also have one other trick that we can do with regards to objects that contain things. So this field I'm not going to actually have on the layout. In fact, from a UI design standpoint, I'll probably be taking this layout, this field, and replacing it with a merge field, because this is not where I will have a user edit or change the name of something. But what I can do is I can use this field as a reference, going to the first area of the inspector, and look at the fact that it is a 21-point high object. And I will select the button right here, and I can see that it's 24. Just in case that looks like it's a pretty tight fit, I'm going to force it to be 21 points in height. Now, if you can force it in height, that means you can force it in width, and I would be able to actually force this down to however wide it needs to be. Let's, for giggles right now, let's go ahead and do it at 40. So when you force an object, FileMaker won't change the size of that object unless you actually click in to edit it. So I'm able to drag this object into that area, and what's going to display is the actual checkbox. The word active won't currently. I will be able to drag this out, but notice that because of that drag, what happened? FileMaker resized itself out. And it's obscuring it because it went below the actual active portal row, but it is still contained within that object. So thank you, FileMaker, for resizing that, even though I had already told you I wanted that size again. Let's go back and set that to 40 and then to 21 again. Now that it resized it out, in order to get this all the way out again, I'm not going to drag it because I know that dragging actually is going to not give me what I want. You have to just put in the number in order to size it out. But likewise, a containment object in FileMaker also allows you to drag beyond the boundaries of the actual object, and it'll still stay contained within that. So in this scenario, if I really wanted to, I could actually choose the inspector and use my text. Nope, paragraph is where it is, and I could align this to the left. So this is now going to show me my object. Remember, if you do copy from that other context, the button over here is acting on its context. The set field is acting on the context relative to that layout. Over here, because I copied the button, I can't keep that action as the context. I have to double click the button and change the context in which the set field is operating. Remember, it has to match this portal right here. So I have to change the context to the portal all with the active selected. FileMaker keeps it selected for me. I have to change this too in order to do that. Context has to be right. If I was to do this, it wouldn't make sense, and it would only take action on the first item. Change it. Everything has to be the matching context. So now it's not portal all. So I guess it just gave away your homework right there. All right, so now this should actually work. I go into browse mode. There's my projects, and everything works. I can see that it's getting chopped off, but I can clean that up. And again, I would take off the word active and just put up at the top the active status, and we've got our little checkbox hanging off to the end, and it's doing what we want. So thank you, Jean-Pierre. Good question, and gives me the opportunity to actually show you how to do that. Can you search for the checkbox using emoji? I've not tried it, Lee, but certainly you can give it a try. And there we go. No more questions for today's lesson. All right, so that means that we are wrapping up today's video. So I hope this video has helped you out. If you're interested, you can subscribe and get notified right here by clicking on the YouTube little logo for the icon. Otherwise, the next video will come up right here, and feel free to check out my website, FileMakerMagazine.com. Until the next video, much luck to you in your development, and happy file making.